idea of an invisible hand. He's known this idea that the market acts as if by an invisible hand. It turns out he only has said it, so far as I've ever been able to find, in 2 places in all of his writings. Here's one example of where he uses it. He's talking about men of commerce here. He says, in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, business people are led by an invisible hand, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society. Now, is he saying that, you know, sort of selfishness and rapacity, right, hunger and greed is a good thing, and so it somehow advances the interests of the society? Let's sin boldly that grace may be abundant. Is that what he's saying? No, he's saying something completely different. So what is he saying? Okay, this is the kind of most subtle part of my talk, and everything else is super easy, I promise. But to get what's going on here, we're gonna have to slice the bologna a little bit thin. Now, is this my mic? It doesn't quite sound right to me. Is this all right, you guys? Okay, if it's your fault, I'm fine. I just don't want it to be my fault. It's sort of buzzing. Is there something I can do to make it better? Is it this thing? I just have to hold it out here awkwardly. Yeah, okay. So it's this thing. Okay, so I'll only hold it when I'm going to actually click it. All right? Okay. Okay, is that a little better? Okay. I was just thinking if somebody were watching this later, it would actually be very distracting. So, okay, so what's Smith saying? Well, he's actually, if you read Adam Smith, it turns out he's a very sophisticated thinker, very nuanced and insightful person. And so here's the first thing to realize, is that you've got to make a distinction between self-interest and selfishness. Every time you take a breath, every time you eat a meal, every time you look both ways before you cross the street or study for your test, get 8 hours of sleep, take your vitamins, you're acting in your self-interest. It's not just like, well, that's a necessary evil. That's a good thing. Any of you that are parents, you spent 18 years trying to pound this into your kids' heads. Brush your teeth, eat, just basic self-interest kind of stuff. At least that. Right? So this is not a morally bad thing. We are creatures. We're made of matter. We have to eat, we have to breathe, we have to drink, we have to sleep. It's how God made us. And so what that means is that there's a realm of our activity that is our legitimate sort of sphere of self-interest. It's the things that we're concerned about, that we're interested in, and that we can do something about and know something about. So I'm a father. So the sort of health and well-being of my children is a part of my self-interest. It's a part of my sphere. Okay, and a lot of what Smith's talking about, that's what he's talking about. Just basic self-interest, okay, that sphere of your influence and concern. The golden rule itself presupposes this. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. What that means is that if you have a properly formed conscience, that you can think, how would I like to be treated? And then use that as a guide to determine how you ought to treat other people. That would only make sense if there was a proper good that had to do with the way that you ought to be treated. Right? If that was a bad thing, you couldn't use it as a guide for moral behavior. So this is just a basic moral philosophy, but we often get mixed up here. We often think, now, you can voluntarily sacrifice something. You might voluntarily fast. You might even voluntarily sacrifice your life. Right? That doesn't sort of violate that, but we'll often, because of those extreme circumstances, imagine that any act of self-interest is somehow morally problematic. And that you get mixed up really quickly if you think that. And so that's part of Smith's point. So he's talking about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. He says their regard to their own interest, right? Not their benevolence. His point is the butcher in a market economy, so this isn't the sort of law of the jungle. It's a market economy in which you have the rule of law. So the butcher can't steal from his neighbor. He can't make you give him your money, right? So there's a rule of law. And so the butcher, in that kind of economic system, can just be thinking about his ordinary concerns. His daughter needs braces. He needs to pay the rent. But in order to achieve that basic self-interest, he has to orient his behavior so that he serves another person. So what the butcher, in order to pay his rent, still has to provide meat that you will freely buy at a price you're willing to pay. So Smith's point is that in a market economy, in a market system, what he called the natural system of liberty, self-interest can be channeled into socially beneficial and other directed outcomes. Now that's completely different from saying greed is good. That's a completely different point. So that's the first thing, is that a market can channel self-interest into socially beneficial outcomes. The second point is this. Notice in that second quote, he said, in spite of. He didn't say because of their natural selfishness and rapacity, in spite of. So in other words, even if the butcher is greedy, why is that not going where I want it to go? There we are. Even if the butcher is actually greedy and not just merely legitimately self-interested, even to fulfill his greed in a market system, the best way to do that is what? To provide meat for customers that they will freely buy at a price that they can afford and to do it better than his competitors. That's Smith's point, is that the natural system of liberty will challenge both our legitimate concerns, our legitimate self-interest, as well as our vices into activities that are generally socially beneficial. Now, the laws have to be set up appropriately so that the incentives go the right way, of course. But that's Smith's point. You see how radically different that is, because the point is that in a market economy, it's not based on greed, but it has a capacity that other economic arrangements don't have to channel even our vices into more beneficial outcomes, at least to do that more than the other options. And you can just think about how socialism doesn't do that. It channels people's sinfulness into a desire to acquire power and to curry favor with policyholders and to things like that. That's Smith's point. It's an incredible insight that people miss because it requires 10 minutes of this kind of tedious lecture to get it. But you got it, so, right? Okay, so that's the greed myth. The last two are really easy. The zero-sum game myth. Yes, this is a picture from Occupy Wall Street. You remember that Occupy Wall Street didn't really accomplish anything, but it did introduce into the American lexicon this distinction between the 1% and the 99%. You all remember that. What's funny is the people at Occupy Wall Street were actually overwhelmingly in the kind of higher than normal income bracket, strangely enough. But including, there was a guy, I got to tell this one story, there was a guy that was interviewed that was there, and he'd gotten a master's degree someplace in the Midwest. Maybe it wasn't Minnesota, Wisconsin, or someplace. But he'd gotten a master's degree in puppetry and had run up $60,000 in student loan debt. And he was mad because he couldn't get a job. That, it's like, it's too bad it didn't occur to him, okay, what's the market for puppetry and how much did I take on? But, it's always the one that I remember. But, okay, so what's this point about the 1% and the 99%? Well, it's essentially, it presupposes a particular understanding of what wealth is like and especially what trade is like. It assumes that if one person has gotten rich, that person can only get rich by somebody else getting poor. So it's an assumption that trade, the nature of kind of free trade is such that for there to be a winner, there has to be a loser. That's what a zero-sum game is. Zero-sum game is a win-lose game. That just means the logic of the rules are set up such that for there to be a winner, there has to be a loser. That's just how the rules are. It's like checkers. It's like most of the games that we play require, the way the rules are, a winner and a loser. So a zero-sum game is a win-lose game. Right? Now, these are terms from game theory, but it's really basic stuff. So you've got a win-lose or a zero-sum game. There's going to be a couple of other possibilities, right? There's going to be a lose-lose game. Lose-lose games are games where everyone that plays ends up worse off than they were when they started. So you don't play those games over and over, so they tend not to catch on, right? So, nuclear war in a confined space or something like that. Lose-lose, right? So the third possibility is a win-win game. Now, what is a win-win game? A win-win game is just a game in which everyone that plays ends up better off than they would have been if they hadn't played. Notice what I said. I didn't say it's a game where everyone ends up equally well off. It's a game where everyone that plays ends up better off than they would have been. So the comparison is when you're trying to say, what kind of game am I in here? It's not to compare yourself with somebody else that's playing. It's to compare yourself playing with what your situation would have been if you hadn't played. And if you're better off than you would have been, then you're in a win-win game. And if you've done it without causing someone else to be worse off. So if you have a friend and he has some kind of party and he says, it's going to be like a casino night in my garage, you come, it'll be really fun, and you all go and none of you have any money, right? But when you get there, he gives you all $10, all right? You play for several hours and some of you leave with $100, some you leave with 1,000, some leave with 10,000, some leave with 10. So what kind of game is that? That's win-win. Now, if you're the $10 guy, you still don't like it, right? Because you're mad that somebody else made more than you. You're still better off than you were. So that's a win-win game. It's a really important distinction. Okay, so the question is, are there types of economic arrangements that are just sort of by their nature win-win? Or is a free trade always involve a winner and a loser?